Scarface was far more than a scandal draped in white powder. It was a dark prophecy hidden behind the mask of pure American excess. Deep within this crime saga lived a secret blueprint that would eventually define the soul of modern hip-hop culture. The critics tore it apart. Several cities banned it, and Al Pacino nearly abandoned the legendary project altogether. Yet, beneath the mansion's violence stood a heart that the Hollywood establishment never truly expected to find. This film redefined how we saw burning ambition and the jagged edges of a dream turning into a feverish nightmare. The script was born from the writer's own addiction, foretelling a destruction that young Michelle Pfeiffer found genuinely terrifying. Her fear didn't come from the director, but from the raw and unhinged energy radiating off her legendary co-star. Here are the 18 forgotten details and hidden truths within Scarface that you likely never noticed before today. Number 18. The most notorious sequence in cinema history nearly destroyed the movie long before it ever reached a public audience. Ratings boards threatened an X rating, claiming the bathroom chainsaw scene was far too gruesome for any mainstream theater. Director Brian De Palma fought back with surgical precision, protecting his vision against the pressure of the censors. He challenged them to find one single frame where the blade actually made contact with a human body. They found nothing, because the horror lives entirely within the viewer's mind, making the scene feel even more visceral. It was a brilliant illusion built through Randy Tom's haunting soundscapes and the flickering, panicked reaction shots of the cast. Stephen Bauer's genuine look of absolute terror as he watches helplessly did more work than any special effect could. De Palma successfully proved the board was reacting to their own imagined gore rather than the actual footage shown, left with no other options. The board finally allowed the scene to pass through the gates, completely uncut. Sound designer Skip Lievsay later confessed that the chainsaw roar was layered with animal screams to trigger a primal response. Number 17. That iconic mark on Tony Montana's face wasn't just paint applied every morning like your standard movie makeup job. The legendary effects artist Tom Savini was the creative mind tasked with bringing that jagged scar to life. Using techniques from Dawn of the Dead, he crafted a semi-permanent prosthetic designed to stay fused for several days. The piece was anchored to Pacino's skin using a potent, industrial-grade medical adhesive that refused to easily let go. It essentially became part of his anatomy throughout the shoot. But the nightly removal process was nothing short of brutal. The glue frequently tore away real layers of skin, resulting in genuine tissue damage that the actor endured for months. Supervisor Ken Chase documented the worsening inflammation and swelling as the grueling production schedule continued toward its end. By the time they reached the final week of the production, the toll on his face was undeniable. Al Pacino had developed a faint, real scar traced perfectly along the path where the fake one had once been. It was a painful instance of method acting taken to a permanent extreme that changed the actor's face forever. Number 16. While Al Pacino leaned into a stylized Cuban accent, there was another actor bringing a much deeper reality to set. Stephen Bauer brought a heavy weight of lived experience and personal history to every frame he occupied on screen. Born in Havana as Esteban Ernesto Echevarria Sampson, he had fled his homeland for Miami as a young child. He was a part of that massive Cuban exodus during the early 1960s, a time of profound cultural change. He understood the quiet struggle of the immigrant and the disorientation of exile in ways the script couldn't capture. Bauer moved with the specific melodic rhythms of Cuban-American life that Pacino could only hope to approximate from outside. Behind the scenes, Bauer quietly mentored Pacino on the subtle nuances of his people's accent and their unique mannerisms. Robert Easton was the official coach, but Bauer provided the soul and authentic emotional reality of the immigrant experience. There is a profound irony in how the history of the film's critical reception eventually unfolded for the two stars. Bauer's grounded performance as Manny Rivera was largely overshadowed by the thunderous, theatrical energy of Pacino's legendary leading role. The man with the real Cuban soul played second to a spectacular performance of identity in a film about truth. Number 15. The massive fortress where Tony Montana lived out his kingpin fantasies wasn't just a set built on a studio lot. Designer Fernando Scarfiotti selected El Furatus, a Mediterranean revival mansion built in 1906, to represent pure American excess. Fernando Scarfiotti didn't actually build that massive fountain or the mansion's gaudy rooms. It was already standing. And that is where the reality gets even stranger. The property had various rumored connections to organized crime figures throughout the 1970s. Whispered associations, the location team only discovered after their scouting work was finally finished. Location manager Janice Pauley later confirmed they finally learned about the property's checkered history during production. Life had already begun imitating the art before the art even truly existed. This mansion was Tony Montana's aesthetic before Oliver Stone ever even wrote the character. Number 14. He introduces his famous little friend to everyone. That legendary line wasn't written by Oliver Stone, and it never appeared in the original or revised screenplays. Al Pacino actually invented it during that final Bloody Mansion shootout. It was a moment of pure improvisational instinct as Tony Montana makes his powder-fueled last stand. Director Brian De Palma absolutely loved the spontaneous line almost immediately. De Palma recognized its absurd bravado perfectly captured Tony's delusional mythology even as bullets tore through him. Script supervisor Betty Griffin carefully noted the sudden improvisation within her official records. Griffin never imagined it would eventually become the film's most frequently quoted dialogue. The line has since been referenced in hundreds of different feature films. It appeared in television shows and various rap songs across 4 decades. Pacino later admitted to interviewer James Lipton that he doesn't even remember ever saying it. He blacked out on performance adrenaline. Now for number 13. One of her breakout roles as the elegant Elvira Hancock, Michelle Pfeiffer delivered a performance of icy detachment and disdain. But that coldness wasn't just acting. Pfeiffer was genuinely unnerved by the intensity Pacino maintained throughout the entire production. He stayed in character between every single take. He maintained Tony Montana's volatile unpredictability even after the cameras had stopped rolling. Pfeiffer later told Rolling Stone she never knew which version of Pacino she would encounter on set, the professional actor or the truly unhinged, dangerous kingpin. That uncertainty kept her perpetually on edge, as acting coach Peggy Furry worked with her during production. Fury helped her channel that real anxiety into Elvira's signature and emotional distance. The performance you see is partly calculated technique and partly a very authentic sense of unease. Pacino's method approach created an environment where fear became indistinguishable from the actual performance. Now, number 12. All that white powder Tony Montana snorts throughout the movie was actually just a mixture of powdered milk. It was pharmaceutical-grade baby laxative chosen because it perfectly mimicked the powder's visual texture. Pacino inhaled massive quantities of the substance during the months of the long shoot. He was snorting it repeatedly for take after take across dozens of different scenes. The fine milk powder eventually accumulated deep within his nasal passages. This created chronic sinus infections that only worsened as the production dragged on. Set medic Barbara Hunter documented the increasing inflammation and bleeding as the filming progressed. By the final weeks, Pacino's nose was legitimately bleeding during the breaks between takes. His sinuses were raw and inflamed from the constant and heavy irritation. Production had to halt several times so he could recover enough to finally continue. Special effects coordinator Ken Pepe later admitted they underestimated the physical toll of repeated fake drug use. On to number 11. When the film opened in December 1983, several city governments refused to allow local theaters to screen it. The violence was simply too graphic. Back when this story was first coming together, local leaders were absolutely scandalized by the raw, gritty dialogue and felt the film's portrayal of Cuban immigrants was far too explosive for the public to handle before a single camera even started rolling on the humid streets. Miami's own mayor, Maurice Fair, led a determined crusade of city officials who were dead set on shutting the entire production down. There was this deep-seated anxiety among the elite that a movie this violent would leave a permanent stain on Miami's sunny reputation, potentially scaring away every tourist and dollar the city relied on. The local Chamber of Commerce wasn't shy about their disdain either, arguing that the script turned their beautiful coastal paradise into a dark war zone where the only law was the word of the drug cartels. But there is a strange and beautiful twist of fate in how the public actually responded to this piece of cinema. Despite all that heavy-handed political pushback, the film exploded into a massive cultural touchstone right in the heart of Miami's own Cuban-American community, taking on a life of its own. For the people living that reality, Tony's journey felt like a distorted, dark mirror that somehow managed to reflect the raw, honest truth of the exile experience in a way nothing else had. It is a bit poetic. Really. Film historian Frank Sinello noted how the very city that tried so hard to bury this movie ended up holding it up as a piece of accidental folk art. Coming in at number 10 on our look back at this cinematic masterpiece, screenwriter Oliver Stone has been incredibly candid over the years, admitting he was drowning in a heavy addiction to white powder while he was trying to put these legendary words on paper. He was essentially pouring his own personal, agonizing tailspin directly into the character of Tony Montana, making that psychological collapse feel uncomfortably real for the audience. All that jagged paranoia, the delusions of grandeur, and the slow-motion self-destruction we see on screen were bleeding directly out of Stone's own chaotic reality at the time. Every bit of that darkness was pulled from his own lived experiences. A terrifying time in his life he would eventually document, with painful honesty in his later memoirs. In a way, the script was a desperate warning. He was shouting at himself, a dark prophecy he put in writing but failed to listen to until his own life finally came crashing down years later. Even the man working alongside him in those smoke-filled rooms, his loyal writing partner, Stanley Weiser, later looked back and confirmed that Stone was in the middle of a terrifying downward spiral while they were grinding through the drafting process together. The sheer, unbridled violence of Tony Montana's ultimate downfall was just a reflection of the internal chaos that was tearing Stone apart during those long nights at the typewriter. It was addiction projected onto celluloid before Stone ever hit rock bottom himself, turning the screenplay into a haunting confession for the man who would eventually direct Platoon. That brutal, confessional honesty is exactly why the movie still carries an uncomfortable sense of truth that manages to resonate with us even 4 decades after its release. Moving along to number 9 on our journey through film history. Think back to that iconic neon blimp drifting through the humid Miami night, carrying that famous, shimmering promise that the entire planet was available to anyone bold enough to take it. That message about the entire world being up for grabs wasn't just some random piece of set decoration meant to fill the empty space in the background. Production designer Ferdinando Scarfiati actually wove it into the film as a recurring visual motif, hiding it in over 12 different scenes for those viewers with a truly sharp eye. Director Brian De Palma treated that blimp as a haunting symbolic reminder of Tony's limitless ambition and the sheer, blinding delusion that fueled his meteoric rise to power. Now, if you really keep your eyes peeled during your next rewatch of this classic, you'll notice that blimp lingering in the background during the most pivotal moments of Tony's rise and fall. Often just a silhouette seen through a window or a cold reflection on glass. It's always there, catching a glint in the window or floating silently above intense conversations where power and loyalty are being weighed in the balance of life and death. Cinematographer John A. Alonso was masterful about framing those shots so the blimp was tucked away in compositions where the average viewer might not even register its haunting presence. It remains a constant, mocking presence in the sky, whispering a promise of total ownership that Tony could never truly grasp or hold on to for more than a fleeting moment. Brian De Palma would eventually sit down with Film Comment magazine to share a little bit of the creative soul behind that specific choice, explaining that the blimp acted almost like a modern Greek chorus, constantly hovering over the story and whispering beautiful, seductive lies into the ears of the damned. Now for number 8. When Tony Montana made his legendary final stand against Sosa's hit squad, The crew utilized over 200 explosive squibs to bring that cinematic carnage to life. For those who don't know, these are those tiny, carefully placed pyrotechnic charges that are used to mimic the visceral, bone-chilling impact of bullets tearing through a person. To pull it off, special effects coordinator Ken Pepiot had to craft a custom protective vest for Al Pacino that was absolutely rigged with hundreds of individual blood packets for the cameras. And then, in one of the most intense moments ever captured on a movie set, the pyrotechnics crew began to detonate every single packet in a lightning-fast sequence, creating that unforgettable illusion of Tony Montana absorbing an almost superhuman amount of incoming lead and fire. It actually took 3 grueling days to capture that one sequence because those little squibs were notorious for misfiring or going off at the exact wrong time during the performance. They would either explode way too early or just refuse to trigger altogether, leaving the cast and crew waiting in a very tense, blood-soaked silence for hours on end. Stunt coordinator Pat Johnson actually kept a detailed record of the chaos, noting that they had to attempt the sequence 19 separate times before they finally got a take they could use. By the time the cameras finally captured a perfect run of the action and the director finally yelled "cut," Pacino was so completely drenched in thick, sticky stage blood that he looked like he'd been dunked headfirst into a giant vat of bright red paint. The makeup team, under the direction of Tom Berman, had the monumental task of scrubbing him clean and resetting the entire look between every single take they attempted to film. It was a painstaking process that swallowed over an hour of time for every single reset. And moving to number 7, let's talk about future Academy Award winner F. Murray Abraham, the man who would go on to win the Best Actor Oscar for Amadeus just 1 year after this film, though he only graces the screen here for about 10 short seconds. He's the one playing that cold, shadowy assassin responsible for the brutal murder of Omar Suarez during that unforgettable hanging sequence from the helicopter high above the water. He first appeared as nothing more than a haunting silhouette, a dark shadow gripping a weapon against the flickering light. F. Murray Abraham only stepped into that minor role because the rent was due and his acting calendar sat empty. Alex Gordon, the man behind the casting, would later recall how they only needed him on set for one solitary day. He worked for the bare minimum wage allowed. Yet just 12 months later, he stood under the industry's brightest lights. There he was, clutching the Academy Award for Best Actor, having somehow surpassed even the legendary Al Pacino that night. Pacino had earned his own nod for a completely different masterpiece that year. Coming in at number 6, the great Giorgio Moroder wove together a heartbeat of pulsing electronic rhythms that defined the very soul of the film. In 1983, that sound was unlike anything else in theaters, and the critics simply could not find its rhythm. The reviews were biting, labeling those synthetic notes as something icy, robotic, and completely devoid of any real human heart. The music felt like a transmission from a distant future, sounding far too artificial for the audiences of that era. For a story rooted in such gritty realism, Variety dismissed the entire score as nothing more than a lifeless, electronic hum. That strange hum echoed through every scene. But 30 years later, we would see that sound through a very different lens. Moroder's work eventually became the sacred blueprint that built the foundation for the entire modern synthwave movement. Visionaries such as Kavinsky and Cliff Martinez would later point to those electronic pulses as their primary source of creative fire. It breathed life into a whole wave of retro-styled electronic beats that defined the cinematic sound of the 2010s. The historian Simon Reynolds has spent years chronicling exactly how deeply that once-hated pulse influenced the music we hear today. What was dismissed as a failure in 1983 slowly transformed into a legendary masterclass for a new generation. At number 5, we remember Miriam Cullen, the woman who brought such a chilling, judgmental weight to Tony's mother. She stayed deeply immersed in her character for the entire shoot, to ensure her look of disgust remained painfully authentic, even when the cameras were off. She kept a cold distance, refusing to share so much as a smile with Pacino. She needed that sense of maternal betrayal to feel heavy and real, something that could not be faked without distance. During their quiet moments on set, she remained chillingly detached, shutting down any attempt at a friendly conversation between takes. The heavy air of a mother's rejection never truly lifted, lingering in the studio long after the director shouted "cut." Her old mentor, the legendary Stella Adler, had taught her years prior and fully gave her blessing to this uncompromising approach. Adler knew the power of that raw honesty, and Pacino himself would later confess how deeply that coldness actually stung him. He told James Lipton that her icy shoulder genuinely hurt his feelings before he realized it was all for the art. The assistant director, Louis Race, was so struck by the palpable tension that he recorded it all in his notes. The crew initially feared a real feud was brewing, only to realize they were witnessing a truly masterful performance taking shape. That friction translated into pure cinematic gold on the silver screen, leading us right into our next story at number 4. When Oliver Stone first put pen to paper, he crafted a sprawling epic that stretched across nearly 4 hours of story. It was a complex web of backroom deals, the dark rot of corruption, and the tragic crumbling of a family legacy. Director Brian De Palma began slashing through those extra threads even as the film was being captured on live celluloid. He spent many sleepless nights huddled with script supervisor Betty Griffin, rewriting the very fabric of the movie until dawn. Actors would arrive on set the next morning only to discover their entire presence in the story had been erased. Imagine the heartbreak of walking onto a major Hollywood set just to find out your character no longer existed. Whole journeys and emotional arcs were either shrunk down to a few lines or vanished into thin air without warning. Martin Bregman later looked back on that time, remembering how the constant changes left the entire cast feeling deeply anxious. A sense of unease hung over the production, as no one knew if their role would survive the next sunset. Editor Gerald B. Greenberg faced the monumental task of stitching together a coherent story from dozens of shifting script versions. The narrative moved like shifting sands every single day. Which brings us to number 3 in A Moment with Al Pacino, right in the heat of production. Pacino looked De Palma in the eye and nearly decided to walk away forever. The weight of Tony Montana's soul felt too heavy. A man who seemed far too dark and irredeemable for any audience. He saw a character who was utterly swallowed by his own hunger for power in the blood on his hands. There was a lingering fear that anyone sitting in the theater would find absolutely nothing to hold on to in him. That pitch-black heart of the role made him wonder if this was a story that audiences were even ready to hear. Al Pacino felt a deep sense of dread that taking on such a gritty role might push away his fans and ruin his legacy. Producer Martin Bregman shared later on that the studio actually weighed the heavy option of pulling the plug on the entire project. Losing Pacino meant certain death for the production, since no other star could possibly fill those shoes once the cameras started rolling. Brian De Palma salvaged the situation by painting Tony Montana not as a common thug, but as a classic Shakespearean tragic figure. He presented the character as a 21st century Macbeth, a man whose hollow greed slowly rots his very soul from the inside. This shift allowed Pacino to stop hunting for sympathy and instead dive headfirst into the terrifying, cold heart of a monster. It was a total cinematic surrender to the dark gravity of the character's own certain and tragic downfall. Coming in at number 2, that legendary shot of Al Pacino in a crisp white suit gripping a heavy M16 rifle. That picture was actually taken during early testing phases as a promotional experiment, occurring many long months in advance, before the director ever shouted action or captured a single frame of film on a professional movie set in Florida. The talented photographer Nancy Ellison led that quiet studio session under the soft glow of a few simple stage lights and backdrops. She worked closely with Pacino, the visionary Patricia Norris, and the skilled prop master Robert Visilia to craft that specific, timeless look. At the time, the studio was simply desperate to see if the public cared enough to help them secure the necessary financing. Essentially, they built the poster to sell a dream, marketing a cinematic masterpiece that did not even exist in reality quite yet. This single image took on a life of its own, eventually becoming the pulse and heartbeat of the entire Scarface legend. Eventually, Brian De Palma felt forced to meticulously recreate that exact pose during the real shoot just to satisfy the growing hype. He had to bridge the gap between the film and the flashy advertisements already plastered across every major industry trade magazine, taking the #1 spot. When Scarface finally hit theaters in December of 1983, it landed with a quiet thud. The initial release felt like a ghost town at the box office, and the critics were absolutely ruthless with their harsh reviews. The great Roger Ebert only gave it 1.5 stars, dismissing the movie as an empty, noisy display of pure excess. The production struggled just to pay back its debts, and most people assumed this violent epic would simply vanish into total obscurity. But then, the magic of the VHS tape arrived, giving this story a second chance to breathe within the comfort of our living rooms. Home video allowed a new generation to stay up late, obsessing over every line of dialogue without any theatrical time interruptions. Over at the legendary Kim's Video in New York City, the owner noted it was their most requested tape. By 1987, by the dawn of the 1990s, the film had morphed into a genuine cultural Bible for an entire generation of movie lovers. It was being quoted like scripture by hip-hop legends like Nas and Jay-Z, while young directors studied it for dark inspiration. It even found a new home in the world of video games as the gold standard for crime epics across the entire globe. Scarface did not just survive that initial cold shoulder. It turned every bit of hate into a foundation for its own immortality. From the harmless white powder that actually irritated Pacino's nose to a poster born before the movie was even a physical reality, from the off-the-cuff lines that turned into modern prayers to that ever-watchful blimp drifting through the humid Miami nights. The entire production was a beautiful, chaotic dance that was somehow carefully disguised as a professional and controlled Hollywood operation. I have to wonder, which of these forgotten pieces of movie history caught you most off guard today? And looking back at the golden era of cinema, which classic crime story do you want us to explore together next time?